In this unit, we'll talk about violence and human nature. In the first part, we'll specify what we mean when we say human nature, what it is for a characteristic to be part of human nature. In the second part, we'll talk about a particular view held by Thomas Hobbes. He held that violence is part of human nature. And he didn't just mean that humans have the ability to behave violently. He meant something much stronger, and we'll talk about what that is. In the third part, we'll talk about Howard Zinn's contrary view. Zinn held that there's no good evidence that violence is part of human nature. All right, we're just going to jump right in right now with part one, human nature. So we'll begin with a simpler question. Rather than directly asking what would make it the case that violence is part of human nature, we'll ask what makes a characteristic part of an individual's nature. We'll then ask what makes a characteristic part of a species' nature. And only then will we turn to the question, what makes violence part of human nature? So let's look at this question. What makes a characteristic part of an individual's nature? In order to answer this question, we have to have some sense of what we have in mind when we use the word nature. This word gets used a few different ways in philosophy. Sometimes people will say, talk about the nature of the good life or the nature of virtue. And there, what they mean is something like, what is the essence of the good life or the essence of virtue? When we talk about an individual's nature, we're not using the word nature in the same way. Instead, we're using the word nature in the way that it's used when people talk about nature versus nurture. We might say, is it part of your genes or the result of your environment? That is a characteristic the result of nature, which is to say it's the result of your genes, or is it instead the result of nurture, which is to say it's the result of your environment? People also talk about a characteristic being innate versus learned. The idea, if it's innate, it's inbuilt. It's the result of your genes. It's the result of your nature. Whereas if it's learned, it's not inbuilt. It's the result of sort of training you went through or your environment or nurture. So throughout this section, when we use the word nature, we're talking about nature in this sense, not nature in the sense of essence or something along those lines. Okay, the next key word in this question is characteristic. So what do we have in mind when we talk about a characteristic being part of an individual's nature? Well, basically any characteristic the individual has can do. So we might talk about an individual's height, weight, or hair color, or eye color, and ask, is the height, weight, hair color, or eye color part of the individual's nature or the result of nurture? We might ask about some psychological characteristics. We might ask, is the fear of snakes the result of nature or nurture, or the fear of guns? Or are your beliefs about U.S. history the result of nature or nurture? Or is your understanding of language the result of nature or nurture? Is your disposition to feel anxious the result of nature? It's just your genes ensured that you would be anxious? Or is it the result of the way your parents raised you, something they did to you? Is it nurture? All sorts of characteristics. Suppose you're easygoing, you go with the flow. Is that the result of your nature, or is that the result of the way you were brought up? We can ask this kind of question for all sorts of characteristics. Now, a good specification of what makes a characteristic part of an individual's nature will get the easy cases right. That is, when a characteristic is clearly part of an individual's nature, it will say that characteristic is part of the individual's nature. And when it's clearly not part of their nature, when it's clearly the result of nurture, it will say that characteristic is the result of nurture. It will also, a good specification will also help with hard cases. Now, it may not tell us exactly how to classify each hard case, but it will tell us sort of what we would need to know in order to do so. Given this information and the specification of individual nature, we'd be able to then classify the hard cases. So what are the easy cases? Well, height presumably is pretty easy. It's the result of nature. Eye color is pretty easy. It's the result of nature. By contrast, a fear of guns is presumably the result of nurture. After all, there's no innate belief about guns, so there can't be an innate attitude towards guns. That is, there's no innate concept of guns, so there can't be an innate attitude towards guns. Presumably, beliefs about U.S. history are the same way. They're the result of nurture. If you don't have very specific nurture, your beliefs about U.S. history would be different. By contrast, weight is more difficult. Is your weight more the result of your genes, or is it more the result of your nurture, the way you eat and exercise, and so on? How about fear of snakes? Is fear of snakes something that's built into human beings, or is it something that is the result of conditioning we go through? How about understanding of language? Is understanding of language the result of the way that we're built, or is it instead the result of careful learning that we go through in order to acquire language? These are the kind of more difficult cases that it would be nice to get some guidance with. Similarly, whether violence is part of an individual's nature, whether aggression is part of an individual's nature, is a more difficult case. Okay, so what makes a characteristic part of an individual's nature? Well, here's a proposal. A characteristic is part of an individual's nature if and only if it's present at birth. Is this a plausible proposal? I don't think so. Let's consider height. Here we have Manute Bol and Spud Webb. Manute Bol is about 7 feet 6 inches tall, and Spud Webb is about 5 feet 7 inches tall. Manute's height is part of his nature. Spud's height is part of his nature. But neither's height is present at birth. Manute wasn't born at 7'6", and Spud Webb wasn't born at 5'7". So it can't be the case that being present at birth is necessary for a characteristic being part of an individual's nature. How about this? A characteristic is part of an individual's nature if and only if it's a result of what's present at birth. Well, let's consider again height. This is Yuji Urushihara. He is probably the greatest Sasuke athlete ever. Sasuke is the Japanese equivalent of American Ninja Warrior. Yuji's height is part of his nature. But it doesn't result exclusively from what's present at birth. Why not? Well, significant changes to his childhood diet would have changed his height a bit. After all, when people from Asian countries move to the United States and have children, their children on average are taller than people in those Asian countries. Why is that? Including the parents. Why is that? It's presumably because US diet is much higher in protein than Asian diets. It's not known exactly, but presumably it's something about diet. Well, that means that Yuji's height isn't exclusively the result of what's present at birth, even if what's present at birth plays a dominant role in determining the sort of rough range that his height will fall in. So it can't be that a characteristic is the result of human nature, of an individual's nature, if and only if it's exclusively the result of what's present at birth. We're going to need something more subtle. So how about this? A characteristic is part of an individual's nature if there's a wide range of circumstances in which it will show little variation, but a narrow range of circumstances in which it will show a lot of variation. Now let's consider height again, and let's focus on Manute. Presumably, there's a wide range of circumstances in which Manute will be between, let's say, 7 feet 4 inches tall and 7 feet 8 inches tall. And there's a pretty narrow range of circumstances in which he'll be quite a bit shorter or quite a bit taller, say under 6 feet tall or over 8 feet tall. So Manute's height is part of his nature. The same goes for Spud Webb and Yuji Urushihara. They're each around 5 feet 7 inches tall. There's a narrow range of circumstances in which either would be under, say, 5'3", and a narrow range of circumstances in which either would be, say, over 6 feet tall. But there's a pretty broad range of circumstances in which this trait will show little variation, in which they'll be between, say, 5'6" and 5'8". So their height is part of their individual natures. Now, let's apply this to the characteristics that we looked at before. Height, we've already seen, comes down on the nature side. It's the result of the way you're built rather than any learning or environmental factors, primarily, that is. What about eye color? Well, again, eye color comes down on the nurture side. There's a pretty wide range of circumstances in which you'll have what other eye color you in fact have, and a pretty narrow range of circumstances in which you won't. Now, you might say, but I can wear contacts. But wearing contacts doesn't change your eye color any more than wearing stilts changes your height. What about fear of guns? Well, fear of guns comes down on the nurture side. Why? Take me. There's a pretty narrow range of circumstances. There's a pretty wide range of circumstances in which I'd end up with a fear of guns. Maybe I saw someone get shot when I was younger. Maybe my parents told me guns were scary. Maybe I primarily encounter guns in movies where they're being used to harm people. But there's also a pretty wide range of circumstances in which I end up without a fear of guns. Maybe my parents teach me guns are for protection. Maybe I've never seen a gun. Maybe I primarily see guns being used to defend good people or something like this. The point is, there's a wide range that can cut either way. It may even be that my exposure to guns isn't as important as my general disposition to feel fear. What about beliefs about US history, the other easy case? Well, again, that comes down on the nurture side. After all, there's a wide range of circumstances in which I'll end up with a certain set of beliefs about US history and a wide range of circumstances in which I'll end up with a very different set of beliefs about US history, and so on and so forth. Okay, what about the hard cases? Weight, fear of snakes, and understanding of language. Well, this specification of what it is for a characteristic to be part of an individual's nature doesn't tell us which side to put weight on, but it does provide the kind of guidance we're looking for because it tells us, given certain facts, here's which way it goes. So what do I mean by that? Well, it tells us that if there's a wide range of circumstances in which my weight will show little variation, but a narrow range in which it will show a lot of variation, then weight comes down on the nature side. But if it turns out that there's a wide range of circumstances in which my weight will show a lot of variation, then weight will come down on the nurture side. So the idea is, think of it more intuitively. If I'm going to be sort of the weight I am, regardless or pretty close to it, regardless of how much what I eat and how much I exercise, then weight comes down on the nature side. But if there's a pretty wide variation that's possible with changes in diet, or exercise, then weight comes down on the nurture side. Same thing with fear of snakes. If it's going to take a lot of work to prevent me from having a fear of snakes, that is, throw me in the vast majority of environments and I'm going to end up with a fear of snakes, then it comes down on the nature side. But if it would be pretty easy to keep me from having a fear of snakes, maybe just don't teach me to fear snakes, then fear of snakes would come down on the nurture side. And the same general principle applies to understanding of language. I'll suggest, and you're welcome to disagree, that understanding of language comes down on the nurture side. Why? Because there's a wide range of circumstances in which I'll end up understanding language, more or less the way I do, and a pretty narrow range in which I won't end up understanding language. Why do I say that? Give me minimal exposure to language and I'll end up understanding language. But pretty much the only way to keep me from understanding language is to give me no exposure to language. Okay. So hopefully you can see roughly how this specification of what it is for a characteristic to be part of an individual's nature works. Next time, we'll consider what makes a characteristic part of a species' nature.